Hey guys, tonight we are about to embark on a haunting and mysterious sleepy story about the most notorious king in English history, Henry VIII. Have you ever imagined that a monarch so powerful he once made all of Europe tremble could end his days in such horrifying misery that the chronicles of history had to hide it for centuries? From a golden prince to a shadow haunted by illness, Henry VIII left behind not only a legacy of bloody marriages, but also a mountain of tragedies buried deep within the palace walls. Tonight, you will hear truths that were long locked away in darkness, details no textbook or historical drama would ever dare reveal a rotting death, desperate conspiracies to cover up an exploding royal corpse, and, in the end, the merciless farce of power finally brought to justice by time itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Every time I see friends from all over the world gathering here, it feels like history itself is coming alive in this little room. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air inside Whitehall Palace that night was thick, suffocating, saturated with the stench of decay that seeped through every crack in the stone walls and wooden beams. Giant candles on the walls had melted down to flickering stubs, casting dim, trembling light across the old velvet carpets. The very carpets where King Henry once strode triumphantly in his days of glory. Now, those vast corridors echoed only with ragged breaths and hurried footsteps of hardened courtiers, clutching handkerchiefs over their faces, some pressing cloths to their mouths as they fought back waves of nausea from the overwhelming odour of royal death. Outside, in the freezing January air of London, a pale fog blanketed the withered rose gardens and the royal courtyards littered with dead leaves. Somewhere in the darkness, hunting hounds howled, but most chilling was the sight of stray dogs licking at the putrid, yellow-brown fluid oozing from beneath the window where King Henry VIII's enormous corpse lay motionless. Servants and guards kept their distance, a mix of horror and pity in their eyes for a man who once embodied supreme power, now reduced to a source of fear for those he had ruled. For centuries, this horrifying story was carefully hidden behind a curtain of silence and official histories written to suit the crown. But recently uncovered secret medical records and modern forensic analysis of Henry's real remains have lifted that veil. Gruesome clinical details emerged. Rotting ulcers, monstrous body mass, and even abnormal chemical build-ups in the royal tissues. These aren't just rumours or legends. They are hard evidence of a decades-long downfall from golden prince to monster upon the throne. But what makes Henry VIII's fate truly haunting is the humiliation and cruelty of his final days, a truth history itself tried to erase. The king who beheaded 2 wives, tore a nation's faith apart, and spread terror across Europe, in the end suffered a fate too shameful to be spoken aloud, the decay of both flesh and dignity. And it all began with what seemed like a minor jousting accident, an event that set in motion years of agony, despair, and horrors no novelist could ever dream up. If you ever thought you knew everything about the Tudor dynasty or the powerful Henry VIII, brace yourself. Tonight, I'll reveal 3 secrets that will shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about this king. And it all starts with the first tragedy, the event that changed England's destiny forever. Imagine this scene, a biting cold January morning in the year 1536 at Greenwich Palace. The London sky is dull and grey, mist drifting lazily over the Thames, blurring the ancient domes and stone towers surrounding the royal residence. In the centre courtyard, the jousting arena rises above the crowds, with blaring brass trumpets and waves of cheers echoing off the stone, announcing a grand day of royal spectacle. Knights, nobles, ladies-in-waiting, merchants, and even commoners gather shoulder to shoulder beneath the grandstands draped in crimson. Banners of red and gold colours of the Tudor dynasty flutter high above on wooden poles, mixing with the pounding hooves of war horses and the flash of polished lances. At the very centre sits Henry VIII, then still the very image of Renaissance power and masculinity astride his colossal war horse, his huge frame encased in custom-forged armour by the greatest craftsmen of Europe. Every piece is engraved with royal emblems, inlaid with gold, worth more than a lifetime's wages for an ordinary man. The king raises his head, gripping his long lance, eyes fixed with icy focus on his opponent. Tension crackles through the air, Every sound fades as the two armored giants charge toward each other at impossible speed, a living, thunderous collision of flesh and steel, symbolizing the courage and honor of an entire age. And then, fate intervenes. The two warhorses crash together with the brutal force of a modern car wreck, a sound that tears through the cold morning. The grandstands erupt in collective gasps. Henry, trapped in his heavy steel, is thrown skyward and crashes down onto the frozen ground with a sickening thud. In a dreadful twist, his massive destrier loses balance and comes crashing directly down onto its master. A deadly silence falls over the entire arena. Servants, nobles, guards, everyone freezes. No one dares to move. No one even breathes. Some people clutch their heads. Noble women stifle screams. Courtiers stand pale and stunned, eyes fixed in horror on the center of the field, where the King of England lies motionless, pinned under the enormous weight of his own warhorse. For those long moments of agonizing suspense, it feels as if the entire kingdom is holding its breath, facing the terrifying possibility that England's fate could be decided by a single, spectacular game gone wrong. 2 hours passed in a chilling silence that blanketed Greenwich Palace and all of England. King Henry VIII lay unconscious on the frozen ground of the tilt-yard, his pale face streaked with dirt and sweat, surrounded by nobles and soldiers holding their breath in dreadful anticipation. In a distant corner of the palace, Queen Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant, clutched her belly, her desperate gaze fixed on the distant window, every second dragging on like an eternity. Tension gripped the entire court. Advisors whispered about succession. Courtiers quietly prayed along the cold stone corridors. At the foot of an ancient staircase, royal physicians in heavy black robes huddled anxiously around an improvised stretcher. They checked the king's breath and pulse, beads of sweat rolling down their brows. Throughout the palace, anxious whispers drifted down the hallways, noble families nervously pondering the fate of the kingdom if Henry failed to awaken. Some feared chaos, or even civil war, if a power vacuum befell the throne. Time seemed suspended. 2 hours, just 2 hours, yet they felt as long as centuries in the history of a nation. Suddenly, Henry VIII stirred and woke. For a moment, hope surged through the crowd. But what followed took everyone by surprise. The king's eyes, once the symbol of wisdom and power, now looked clouded, cold, filled with suspicion and anger. His very first words were not gratitude for survival, nor concern for his people or family, but a furious demand. Why had the tournament been stopped? From that day forward, the Renaissance king, who charmed with poetry, spoke 4 languages, composed music, danced till dawn, and could debate philosophy with anyone, began to change. Eyewitnesses described a shift in his gaze, sometimes burning with menace, sometimes shadowed with something hidden and troubled. After the accident, Henry became a different man, suspicious, easily provoked, prone to fits of rage or deep depression, and uncharacteristically volatile. Modern neuroscience now suggests that the tremendous impact of that fall damaged Henry's frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for emotion, reason, morality, and self-control. Previously, for all his power, Henry was famed for restraint, often forgiving nobles and maintaining harmony at court. For over 20 years of marriage with Catherine of Aragon, he had rarely provoked major scandals or ordered executions. But after January 1536, everything changed. Just 4 months after the accident, Anne Boleyn, once his cherished queen, was led to the scaffold. This marked the beginning of a long spiral. Executions, suspicions, and purges followed in quick succession, plunging the Tudor dynasty into over a decade of instability and darkness. Not long after Anne Boleyn lost her head, another powerful figure fell, Thomas Cromwell. The trusted advisor who had once secured Henry's throne became the next casualty of the king's violent wrath. The change in Henry's temperament spread through the palace like a haunting shadow. Servants and courtiers whispered of nights filled with sobbing, mornings shaken by his furious rants, and the king smashing furniture, screaming for the blood of traitors. The atmosphere in the palace was thick with unease, a constant sense of impending doom that kept everyone living in fear. But the psychological transformation was only the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare, one that would last for 11 excruciating years. That fateful accident did not just kill the good within Henry VIII. It tore open an old wound on his leg, a scar left from a riding fall many years before. It had long since healed, leaving only a faint mark. Yet after the catastrophic fall in 1536, the wound was ripped wide open again, becoming an infection that would never truly heal. Imagine for a moment England in that era, no concept of antibiotics, no understanding of germs, or how to treat an open wound. Treatments were limited to rinsing with strong spirits, binding the injury, and offering prayers. Even a small open sore was dangerous for common folk, but Henry's ulcers, as large as tennis balls on both legs, were a death sentence stretched over years. Thick yellow pus and foul blood oozed daily, never drying or closing, even when swathed in silk imported from Arabia. The slightest brush could make the king howl in agony. Some nights, the pain was so severe that Henry screamed through the corridors, tormenting not only himself, but the desperate doctors who could offer no relief. This wound was not just a source of relentless physical pain, it was a slow-motion death sentence. The royal physicians were helpless, recording gruesome descriptions in their journals. Ulcers so foul and grievous, they tormented the flesh more than any dungeon. Twice a day, servants had to draw out pus into bronze bowls and secretly carry it far from the palace. But all attempts to hide the condition only made things worse. For Henry, the agony was not only physical, but the shame of watching his once mighty body betray him, leaving him dependent on fearful servants and increasingly despairing doctors. It was hell on earth, a place where power meant nothing in the face of disease and the unyielding march of time. Few people know that the gruesome secrets of King Henry VIII's illness were meticulously recorded by his royal physician doctor, Thomas Vicker, who hid thick notebooks in the Royal College of Physicians. It wasn't until the 1960s, when modern researchers stumbled upon them, that the world was shocked by the horrifying details. Gaping ulcers, deep to the bone, constantly oozing thick yellow pus, emitting such a foul stench that anyone who approached was overcome with nausea. The king's legs, once a symbol of his prowess on the battlefield, had become his greatest shame. Every day, sometimes twice daily, physicians had to drain bowlfuls of foul-smelling pus and blood from the king's legs. Servants would silently, almost furtively, carry the bronze bowls outside, both embarrassed and terrified that the overpowering odour might reveal the king's true condition. But that was only the beginning. Driven by pride and paranoia, Henry VIII desperately sought to hide his own disgrace. He devised special bandages weighted with lead, naively believing that pressure would force the wounds to close. Tragically, this only worsened the problem, reducing blood flow and spreading the infection even further. Henry's paranoia peaked as he doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, daily massaging his skin with blends of rose oil and ambergris. He hoped the luxurious scents would mask the rot, but in reality, they only intensified the oppressive air, a nauseating mix of death and perfumed oils wafting through the palace. To further maintain his powerful image, Henry VIII commanded his court painters to depict him in magnificent poses, legs strong and muscular, standing proudly in vast halls. This was a false image, a painted lie handed down to future generations, obscuring the truth of a monarch whose body was rotting away in his final years. It was more than a lie on canvas. It was a veil drawn over the painful truth about the price of absolute power. All of Henry VIII's desperate attempts to hide his illness only prolonged his tragedy. The truth was that the infection did not stay confined to his ulcerated legs. It silently poisoned his entire bloodstream. Each passing day, toxins born from decaying tissues coursed through his veins, invading every organ: his brain, his liver, his heart. His body was under siege, locked in an invisible, relentless war, with every cell slowly surrendering. Modern scientists, after analyzing medical records and witness accounts, I believe Henry VIII suffered from chronic osteomyelitis, a disease that unleashed a steady stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout his body, resulting in an endless cycle of symptoms that grew worse with each day. The physical agony was unending. Imagine the worst toothache of your life, but burning in both legs and never stopping for over a decade. There were days when Henry was soaked in sweat from a high fever, followed by days shivering with chills, his skin yellowed by toxins as his liver and blood failed. Yet the physical pain was not the worst of it. Once those toxins invaded his brain, the boundaries between reason and emotion were destroyed. Henry became wildly unpredictable, sometimes laughing loudly at a crude joke, only to erupt a moment later, ordering the jester's execution. Servants whispered of sleepless nights when Henry wandered his chambers, limping and muttering about shadows lurking. Convinced that enemies hid in every corner, he began to suspect everyone, certain that his food was being poisoned, that his wives were unfaithful, even that foreign ambassadors were assassins in disguise. His paranoia spread like a disease, casting a shadow over the entire court. The palace, once filled with dazzling feasts and splendid dances, was now reduced to a labyrinth of suspicion and dread. Anyone who accidentally met the king's eye lived in fear of becoming the next victim of his erratic wrath. Henry VIII, once a symbol of English glory and power, was now imprisoned in his own decaying body and tormented mind, watching the world collapse around him in a spiral of suspicion and horror. By the 1940s of the 16th century, darkness loomed over the Tudor dynasty. Just 4 years after his catastrophic accident, Henry VIII had become a different man, old, irritable, heavy-set, and consumed by power and loneliness. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, had been sent to the scaffold. His third wife, Jane Seymour, gave him a son before dying herself, and his brief marriage to Anne of Cleves ended in disappointment. The court was thrown into chaos by purges and shifting allegiances, everyone walking on eggshells. Amid this storm of suspicion, a young girl appeared. Catherine Howard, just 17 years old. She became the object of desire for the 50-year-old king. The contrast between Catherine and Henry was truly bizarre. The once vigorous king was now morbidly obese. Accounts describe the spectacle of 4 strong servants lifting the king onto his horse, with specially tailored clothing to fit his enormous body. Even the palace itself was modified. Chairs were redesigned, doorways widened, and floors reinforced to support his weight. In the presence of the youthful and striking Catherine Howard, Henry seemed both a pitiable and terrifying giant. Courtiers whispered that Henry's pursuit of Catherine made everyone uncomfortable. The young woman reportedly had to use strong wine just to endure intimacy with the ailing king. Once Henry's flirtations had inspired women across Europe, now they were a burden for a teenage girl caught in the whirlwind of power. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. The ulcers, disgusting but manageable for 6 years, suddenly worsened. Dr. Vickers' secret notes describe how the discharge from Henry's wounds shifted from yellow-white to green, then to a rotten brown. The stench was no longer merely unpleasant. It became the smell of death itself, causing anyone nearby to flee in horror. Guards burned incense and scattered herbs throughout his chamber, but nothing could combat the overpowering odor of decay. At the same time, Henry's weight ballooned. He ate constantly to distract from the pain, unable to exercise, and his body expanded beyond all measure. From 113 kilograms, he soared to 157 kilograms, his old suit of armor, with a 122-centimeter waist at the Tower of London, no longer fit. By 1545, Henry had to commission new armor, with a 143-centimeter waist, wider than most modern refrigerators. The palace itself was altered, while Henry found himself imprisoned within his own monstrous, decaying body. It wasn't just Henry VIII's body that was transformed. His magnificent palace itself had to undergo an unprecedented surgery in English royal history. Architects, carpenters, and builders were kept busy day and night, widening passageways, expanding door frames, and reinforcing floors that sagged dangerously under the king's immense weight. Even today at Hampton Court, one can still see the colossal beams added to support the rooms Henry frequented during his final years. Lavish chairs were custom-made, their armrests removable, because Henry had grown too large to fit in standard seats. Every item in his chambers was modified. Beds, carriages, even the dining table all became silent witnesses to a royal power now imprisoned within a decaying body. Palace servants devised a complex system of pulleys and ropes just to raise the king from his bed each morning. Even the act of dressing him required 4 strong attendants, gently maneuvering his massive, pain-ridden limbs to avoid tearing open wounds or causing fresh bleeding. Afterward, he would be transferred to a large wooden wheelchair, but this too was carefully concealed from public view. The king's daily life became a sequence of ceremonial routines, elaborate performances designed to mask his rapid decline. In public, Henry appeared grand and imposing, draped in luxurious robes, crowned, scepter in hand, as if nothing could topple him. But behind closed doors, another reality reigned. The stench of decay, groans in the night, desperate physicians discussing pain relief, and a constant atmosphere of fear that permeated every hallway. Not only was his body collapsing, but Henry's mind also grew ever more unstable. He spiraled deeper into paranoia, wild mood swings, and crushing loneliness. The king's final years were not only dramatic for himself, but for the entire court, where every secret and ghastly truth was smothered beneath a glittering facade of pageantry and power. By 1544, Henry VIII's decline was no longer something that could be hidden behind a facade of royal authority. The journals of courtiers and officials began to use stronger words. Paranoid, madness, out of control. Random rages now gave way to strange, anxious behavior. The English royal court became a hotbed of chilling rumors across Europe, about a king lost in delirium. Henry VIII was often seen conversing, even arguing fiercely, with people who simply weren't there, from his late father, King Henry VII, to his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11. Servants and advisors recounted how, in the midst of important council meetings, the king would suddenly freeze, his face draining of colour as he stared at empty space, as if confronting the ghosts of his past. At times he was heard whispering, "No, not now," or "Leave me be," only to erupt in anger at those present. The French ambassador described a particularly chilling scene at a palace banquet. Henry suddenly stood, pointed at an empty chair, and angrily commanded Anne Boleyn, dead for years, to stop mocking him. Witnesses said the court had become a stage for the king's madness, each ceremony or meeting turning into a bizarre performance with phantoms only Henry could see. His paranoia reached new extremes. Henry became convinced his servants were plotting to poison him via the pus-soaked bandages on his legs. He demanded that all old dressings be brought to him for personal inspection, even smelling each one before ordering them burned. He didn't stop there. He hired professional food tasters not only for meals but for all his medicines as well. Unfortunate servants had to apply ointments to their own skin before the king would touch them, just to prove there was no poison. The entire palace was enveloped in an atmosphere of fear, artificial politeness, and intense anxiety. Every word and gesture from Henry VIII became a source of dread. No one knew if tomorrow they would be allowed back into the court or become the next victim of the king's wrath or delusions. By Christmas of 1546, King Henry VIII had become an almost unrecognizable figure, a distorted shadow of his former self. Contemporary accounts described him as a massive bulk, slumped upon his throne, legs swollen and propped up on a stool, unable to stand without the help of 3 or 4 strong servants. His face had swollen to nearly double its former size, features grotesquely distorted by fluid buildup, cheeks sagging, neck thickened, and multiple chins giving him an almost monstrous appearance. His once clear blue eyes, praised by poets as bright as a summer sky, had lost all their light, turning yellowed and bloodshot, sinking deep into purple-puffed sockets, always dull and fatigued. The stench of death clung to his entire being, impossible to mask. The royal household used barrel after barrel of expensive perfumes, burned incense, and scattered fresh herbs along the corridors, but nothing could rid him of the fetid smell. Courtiers discreetly pressed scented balls to their noses when approaching the throne, while some delicate ladies in waiting would rush out to vomit immediately after presenting themselves. But the most shocking detail was hidden in Henry's last official portrait, the famous Whitehall painting that became the iconic image of royal power. Few know that when restorers x-rayed the painting in 1960, they uncovered a horrifying secret. The king's left hand, which appears to grip a simple cane, was originally painted holding something entirely different: a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre staff was not just a Gothic accessory, it was the clearest sign of Henry's obsession with death at the end of his life. People said he kept the staff close, often tapping the skull on the floor while speaking, a constant reminder to himself and everyone around him that death was ever near. Even his most loyal courtiers shuddered at the gesture, deeply unsettled by the king's madness and his consuming obsession that haunted the final years of a monarch who had once shaken all of Europe. Around Henry VIII's skull-top staff, rumours grew with each passing year. Some claimed the skull was that of a monk, a victim of the bloody dissolution of the monasteries ordered by Henry himself. Others insisted it belonged to a former enemy, executed at the king's command, serving as a grim reminder of absolute power and unrelenting vengeance. What's certain is that the portrait artist, Hans Holbein, recorded this macabre detail truthfully in Henry's final painting, unflinchingly revealing a king obsessed with death and isolated to his last breath. But the tragedy extended even after Henry's death. His son, Edward VI, then just a boy, could not bear the idea of his great father being remembered as a madman with a skull cane. On Edward's orders, the skull was painted over, turning the staff back into an ordinary object, erasing one of the rare clues to Henry's mental collapse at the end of his life. In the last months of 1546, the English court suffocated in a climate of unprecedented dread. Every day was a tense performance, where each gesture or glance could signal an impending storm. Courtiers, pages, and servants devised a sophisticated warning system to protect one another. Coloured ribbons pinned to clothing discreetly signalled the king's mood. Red meant Henry was enraged. Stay away. Black marked despair or depression. White appeared only during increasingly rare moments of calm. A single trivial act could result in disaster. A servant who accidentally sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation, suspected of poisoning the king. A lady-in-waiting who stepped on the king's robe was exiled, her family stripped of all land. Most frightening of all, Henry began issuing execution orders for people who were already dead, utterly forgetting he had condemned them years before. In those days, the English court resembled a shadowy theatre, every act tinged with madness, macabre rituals, and the collapse not just of a king, but of the very spirit haunting an entire kingdom. In the last months of his reign, every event at the Tudor palace became a tense spectacle, but none compared to the infamous state banquet of November 1546. The evening was heavy. The glow of hundreds of candles could not dispel the gloomy air that hung over the great hall. Dukes, earls, and foreign ambassadors sat in splendid attire, their faces carefully masking fear of the dying king whom all still had to revere. The French ambassador witnessed the chilling scene firsthand. Henry VIII, enormous and frail, struggled painfully to stand in the midst of the banquet, needing 2 servants to help him up. Once upright, he suddenly pointed at an empty chair, his eyes wild and his voice trembling with rage and terror. "You dare show your face at my table?" He screamed at nothing but cold, invisible air. The packed court froze, not a soul daring to move or meet the king's gaze. The atmosphere was thick. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the next horror. Henry continued to shout into the emptiness, now filled with threat and hatred. "I took your head once, I'll take it again." Clearly, in his mind, the ghost of Anne Boleyn still haunted him relentlessly. When the fit of rage and fear finally passed, Henry collapsed back onto his massive chair, face pale, drenched in sweat. Yet, just minutes later, he resumed eating as if nothing had happened, while the hall remained shrouded in terror. That night's spectacle became the talk of the palace for weeks, adding yet another dark chapter to the legend of Henry VIII's downfall. A king who could no longer distinguish the boundaries between reality and nightmare, between the living and the dead. January 1547. At the freezing Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII entered the final agony of his life, a collapse so horrific that even his closest chroniclers dared not write the truth. The ulcers on his legs had now spread over his entire shins, growing deeper until the white bone gleamed beneath rotting flesh. The hidden medical notes of Dr. Thomas Wendy, unearthed in a private collection in 1891, described in excruciating detail the gaping wounds, the surrounding flesh blackened with unmistakable signs of necrosis and deadly infection. The air in the king's chamber was always thick with the reek of decay. Servants had to cover their mouths whenever they changed his sheets, and many fainted outright, unable to withstand the stench rising from Henry's body. Every window was kept wide open, regardless of the January cold, in the vain hope of keeping the rot from flooding the palace. Henry's body by this point was little more than a living corpse. Skin yellow and waxy from liver failure, eyes white and vacant, devoid of all humanity. His tongue had swollen so badly that he could barely speak, his words now reduced to wet, gurgling sounds only the most loyal attendants could decipher. His breath stank of rotten meat, a terrifying sign that the infection had reached his digestive system. The king's huge bulk made his care almost impossible. It took 6 strong men just to turn him in bed, hoping to prevent new bed sores, though his back and legs were already riddled with festering, oozing sores stretching from knees to spine. But the most haunting image from Henry's last days was not just his suffering flesh, but the spectacle of a once mighty, arrogant king reduced to a suppurating, helpless wreck groaning in agony, as doctors changed his bandages and loyal courtiers tried to ease his torment. Power, pride, and all illusions of immortality vanished, leaving only Henry VIII, dissolving in misery on his cold, lonely throne. On January 20th, the palace doctors witnessed a horrifying turn in Henry VIII's condition, what modern medicine now recognizes as the onset of multi-organ failure. His kidneys, after years of battling the constant influx of toxins from infected leg ulcers, finally began to fail. Whenever he could urinate, it came out as dark brown liquid, reeking so strongly of ammonia that it filled the room. His abdomen became bloated with yellow fluid, further distending his already enormous waistline, causing excruciating pressure on all his organs. During these final days, Henry's mind swung between chilling lucidity and utter delirium. In lucid moments, he fully realized death was approaching. He desperately begged the physicians to save him, promising them gold, fame, lands, even noble titles, if they could cure him. But when all remedies failed, Henry would roar in fury, threatening torture and execution to every physician who dared fail him, though by now he no longer had the strength to sign any decree himself. In his feverish episodes, the king could be heard calling out to his mother Elizabeth of York, dead for nearly 40 years, pleading with her to shield him from the demons he imagined crawling up from beneath his bed. Sometimes he would murmur to Arthur, his long-dead brother, sobbing apologies for having taken both the crown and Arthur's wife. Saddest of all were the moments when Henry called for Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, the woman who had once loved him, above all begging for her forgiveness, though she had died in cold abandonment 11 years earlier. Henry's last words became a trembling, desperate confession. Yet, even as the king endured such agony of body and spirit, the court continued its grand masquerade. Official proclamations declared the king was merely recovering from a mild illness. Foreign ambassadors were told that Henry just needed rest and would soon resume business and receive visitors as usual. While the palace outwardly remained filled with flowers, candles, and optimistic proclamations, behind the scenes, a silent but intense struggle for England's fate unfolded. Edward Seymour, the powerful brother-in-law of Henry, and other Privy Council members, discreetly prepared for succession, reviewing decrees, weighing alliances, and bracing for any upheaval the king's death might unleash. They knew well Henry had only days, perhaps hours left. On January 27th, tragedy struck with full force. Henry suddenly suffered a violent stroke, what modern medicine recognizes as a severe cerebral infarction. One side of his face drooped hideously, his eyes sunken, saliva pooling in a long streak on white pillows as his facial muscles lost all control. His tongue swelled and went numb, reducing every sound to incoherent gurgles. The once mighty king, whose words had shaken all of Europe, now could not even ask for a sip of water. Yet the tyrant's iron will refuse to yield. With his remaining trembling hand, Henry struggled to sign a death warrant for the Duke of Norfolk, his once loyal right hand, now fallen from grace. The signature was little more than a meaningless scrawl, a subject of historical debate to this day. Was it truly Henry's, or merely the ghost of power writhing in his dying moments? Chillingly, Henry's attendants, terrified even of the dying king, stood ready to carry out the execution, indifferent to the cruel truth that their master was hardly human any longer. Only with Henry's death the following morning did the Duke of Norfolk escape history's blade, a final exclamation mark to an age of crisis and fear. It was here that Henry VIII's story took a grim turn, one that historians and royal descendants would work tirelessly to hide for centuries. It was not just the death of a king, but the last, tragic, horrifying act of a dynasty that forever altered the face of England. Henry VIII did not die peacefully in his sleep as official records proclaimed. The truth, revealed through the private diary of Archbishop Cranmer, an eerie, rare account discovered at Lambeth Palace Library in 1983, tells a much darker tale. That night, Cranmer was urgently summoned to Whitehall around midnight to perform the final rites for a dying king. Even for a seasoned clergyman who had witnessed many deaths, the scene that greeted him was profoundly disturbing. On a massive reinforced bed, Henry writhed in violent convulsions, so severe that it took 6 strong men to hold his enormous body down, preventing him from breaking his own bones. Each spasm was accompanied by the groaning and cracking of the wood frame, straining under the weight of the dying giant. Each bout of vomiting brought up black bile, filling the room with a deathly stench beyond description. Cranmer later wrote that he had to excuse himself twice to vomit, unable to withstand the reek and horror. Between fits, in brief moments of calm, Henry would open his eyes and gaze into empty space, as if seeing the souls of children who had never drawn breath, the result of miscarriages and stillbirths, a lifelong torment over the unfulfilled quest for an heir. He would mumble pleas for forgiveness, promising that, if he could live again, he would be a better father. Then the atmosphere would darken, as Henry suddenly screamed about flames that only he could see, begging someone to put out the hellfire surrounding him. As the clock struck 2 in the morning on January 28th, Henry's breathing shifted to a strange, wet gurgle, what modern doctors call the death rattle. Archbishop Cranmer, following Protestant custom, leaned in, took the king's swollen hand, and gently asked that, if Henry still held faith in Christ, he should squeeze as a final sign of salvation. Henry managed one weak, slow squeeze, and then his hand slackened and fell, forever still. At 2:07 in the morning on January 28th, 1547, King Henry VIII of England took his last breath on a bed saturated with the stench of death. Yet the horror of the Tudor court did not end with the king's passing, it only grew worse in the days that followed. Henry's corpse, already swollen from illness and fluids, began to decompose at an alarming rate. Years of chronic infection had not only destroyed him in life, but after death, they accelerated the process of putrefaction. Within hours, his massive body inflated grotesquely, as bacteria inside produced gases that caused his abdomen and limbs to balloon like a swollen drum. The already unbearable odor became overwhelming, spreading through the corridors and forcing servants to clamp cloths over their faces. Many wretched or even fainted right outside the royal chamber. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, was forced to make an extraordinary decision: to keep the king's death secret for 3 days, to buy time for both political manoeuvring and practical burial arrangements. But they faced an urgent crisis: how to deal with a corpse decomposing too rapidly for public display. Embalmers were summoned at once, arriving with tools, shrouds, aromatic oils, and salt, but they were utterly confounded by the size and condition of the king. Upon opening the body to remove the internal organs for preservation, they discovered the liver had swollen and rotted so badly it fell apart at a touch. The heart was nearly twice normal size, surrounded by slimy yellow fluid. The intestines had turned black and green, a sign of extreme necrosis and infection. One young embalmer's assistant fainted on the spot when the stomach was cut open, releasing a stench so powerful the entire room fled. Unable to bear it, the embalmers worked feverishly for 2 days straight, resorting to the most extreme Tudor-era techniques, stuffing the abdominal and chest cavities with salt, pungent herbs, and spices, swaddling the body in multiple layers of cloth soaked in pitch, desperately hoping to slow the decay before the burial procession could begin. After the embalmers stuffed over 45 kilograms of salt and pungent aromatic herbs into Henry's abdominal cavity, they wrapped his corpse in thick layers of waxed cloth, drenched in pitch and turpentine, a flammable, acrid-smelling substance, usually reserved for cases of extreme decay. Everything was then sealed inside a massive lead coffin, custom-built and specially reinforced to bear the combined weight of the king's body and all the embalming materials. That coffin weighed nearly half a ton, a heavy burden for the dynasty in every sense. Yet even these extreme measures could not stop the relentless decay. During the days of lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses from courtiers to palace guards whispered stories about the bizarre noises coming from inside the coffin. Sharp pops, wet gurgles, even faint hissing sounds. These were the gases of decomposition, trapped and building pressure within the thick lead. The lead casing itself began to bulge, warping in grotesque patterns. To hide this disturbing transformation, officials hastily draped thick black cloths over the coffin lid, ensuring no one would glimpse the horror beneath. After several stifling days and the completion of burial preparations, the funeral procession set off for Henry's final resting place at Windsor Castle on February 14th. The massive coffin required a specially constructed carriage, pulled by 8 powerful horses, to navigate the muddy, slippery winter roads of England. What should have been a one-day journey dragged into 3. The weight was punishing. Horses grew exhausted, attendants weary, the whole cortege crawling through bitter cold. On the second night, the procession paused at Shorn Abbey, a place, ironically, once dissolved by Henry's own orders during his campaign against the church. The coffin was set in the ancient chapel overnight. No one suspected that here, history's most macabre royal funeral scene would unfold. The pressure from days of accumulated gases finally exceeded the strength of the lead casing. In the dead of night, a tremendous bang like a thunderclap echoed through the abbey. Rousing everyone in terror, the lead coffin had burst open, spewing gas and putrid fluid that pooled across the cold stone floor. The stench was so overwhelming that the guards abandoned their posts, fleeing from the infernal scene. The blackish-brown liquid, reeking of death, spread in a vast puddle, marking the ultimate humiliation for the man who once called himself England's Lord and God's anointed. Yet this was still not the end of the ignominy. The following morning, an even more horrifying scene unfolded inside the ancient chapel. As the palace workers arrived to clean up after the previous night's disaster, they were stunned to discover evidence that wild dogs had slipped into the chapel under cover of darkness. The animals were found greedily lapping up the putrid liquid that had leaked from the king's ruptured coffin. The man who had once declared himself God's anointed, who had dared defy the Pope and the Church of Rome to assert his own divine right, ended his earthly reign beneath the tongues of scavenging dogs. Royal labourers, faces masked and hands gloved, stuffed perfumed cloths into their mouths to counter the stench, using sawdust and quicklime to soak up every trace of the foul, deathly fluid, desperately trying to dispel the pall of death that haunted every corner of the chapel. The lead coffin was hastily resealed, but any last vestige of royal dignity was irretrievably lost. When the beleaguered funeral procession finally crept into Windsor Castle, all was subdued, haunted, and ashamed. Gone were the elaborate rituals, the fanfares and endless prayers. Henry was buried quickly, under strict guard, as if his very death was something to be hidden from the world. The scandal was so great that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of England, ordered absolute silence from all witnesses. Anyone who breathed a word would face summary execution. The only thing left in the official record was a brief, cold statement. Henry VIII died peacefully and was buried with all royal honours. The gruesome truth, ultimately, was buried with him beneath cold lead, surfacing only centuries later in secret diaries and stray foreign diplomatic reports. So ended Henry VIII, the king who brought terror, executed wives, destroyed abbeys, and cowed a nation dying in a state of utter putrefaction, his screams echoing through history. His corpse, so rotten it exploded in its coffin, marked the dissolution of all the glory and power he once held, leaving only the bitter lesson of what truly awaits those who believe themselves immortal. The entire humiliating scene was buried beneath a veil of absolute secrecy. Everyone present, every attendant, every guard, every worker was threatened with the severest punishment should they utter a single word. The silence was enforced not merely by law, but by fear, the kind of fear that lingers long after the body has vanished. And so, the real story faded from the gilded halls, whispered only in trembling voices behind locked doors, and carefully preserved in secret diplomatic letters sent abroad, or in private diaries hidden deep in the archives of foreign courts. Official English history tells a different tale. There, one reads only that Henry VIII passed away peacefully, surrounded by dignity and honour, and was laid to rest in a ceremony befitting a mighty king. There is not a hint of the stench, the chaos, or the ignominy that shadowed those final days. The truth of what happened to England's most infamous monarch would remain hidden for centuries, kept away from the light by those who wished to protect the illusion of royal grandeur. But the reality, as it sometimes does, found its way through the cracks of time. Foreign ambassadors wrote of the horrors they heard from frightened English courtiers. Secret memoirs and hidden letters slowly resurfaced, painting a picture so different from the tranquil legends spun for the public. It was not a peaceful death. It was a spectacle of suffering and abandonment. This was the fate of the king who had beheaded 2 wives, dissolved the monasteries that had stood for centuries, and sowed terror across his nation. In the end, Henry did not pass from this world with prayers and hymns. He died in unimaginable agony, his once mighty body rotting and bursting apart inside his coffin, abandoned by the very people who once trembled at his word. In those last dreadful days, the shadows grew long across the palace floors. Candles burned low and servants moved quietly through the corridors, careful not to disturb the silence with even a cough. Behind heavy velvet curtains, the official chroniclers composed lines about peace and royal virtue, while behind closed doors, men and women whispered to one another about the true end of England's golden prince. When the time came for the final burial, there was no grand celebration, no music, no chorus of voices singing for the soul of a king. The coffin was lowered into the earth as quickly and quietly as possible, the heavy lid sealing away both the body and the shame that clung to it. Above ground, the story was changed, polished until it shone like gold. A peaceful king, a dignified passing, a legacy untouched by disgrace. But for those who had seen, for those who had smelled the decay and heard the awful sounds, for those who had watched the procession limp slowly through the mud and rain, none could ever forget the truth. They carried it with them like a weight, unable to speak but always remembering. The legacy of Henry VIII became something darker than the chronicles would admit. For all his power, for all his wealth and ambition, for all the dread he inspired, he was not spared the final indignities of the flesh. In his last hours, no crown could protect him from suffering. No army could ward off decay. His life, so often filled with thunder and spectacle, ended in silence and shadows. And what remains? Not just the ruins of abbeys or the stories of frightened queens, not just the portraits that show a king strong and unsmiling. What remains is a lesson, quiet and insistent, that echoes across the centuries. Absolute power does not merely corrupt a man, it can strip away every shred of dignity, right up until the final breath. Those who wield it unchecked may one day find themselves as Henry did, alone, broken, and swiftly forgotten by the world they once ruled. As night falls, and the last echoes fade from the stone walls of Windsor, perhaps there is a comfort in knowing the truth at last. In the hush of darkness, history speaks softly, not just of greatness and glory, but of the price paid for power held too tightly, for too long. So, if you listen closely as you drift to sleep, you may still hear the warning carried on the wind. The fate of kings and commoners is not so different after all, and in the end, every crown returns to dust. And you know, as the lies fade away and the curtain of history falls silent, curiosity always lingers. Tonight, after journeying through the tragic ending and bitter lesson of a king who once seemed untouchable, perhaps you're still left wondering, were there even darker horrors hidden behind the dazzling crown of Henry VIII? Was the rotting coffin only the beginning of a string of chilling secrets never fully told? Don't slip away just yet, because right now, I'm about to share with you 5 of the most disturbing facts about Henry VIII, details you won't find in your textbooks, nor see on any costume drama. Each truth is a shadowy puzzle piece, helping us see the real, haunting portrait of England's most infamous king. Are you ready? Let your lamp burn a little longer, pull the covers close, and brace yourself to face secrets that just might send a shiver down your spine. The first disturbing fact: the living corpse on the throne, Henry VIII, was eaten by maggots while still alive. Few realize that in the long, dreadful years before his death, Henry VIII was not only a powerful monarch, but, in truth, a living corpse haunting his own palace. As disease and festering wounds relentlessly ravaged his legs, his body became a feast for the most horrifying of parasites, maggots. Royal physicians of the day recorded a grisly reality. Beneath silk wrappings and regal bandages, colonies of maggots hatched and thrived inside the king's putrefying wounds. It became a daily ritual. Servants and doctors were forced to tend to the swarms of maggots living in the royal flesh. With small instruments, they gently plucked out plump, white larvae from the rotten meat, trying not to inflict even more pain on Henry. The chamber always smelled faintly of dampness and medicinal herbs, mixed with the overpowering scent of perfume and the unmistakable stench of decay. On sweltering summer days, the maggots bred so rapidly that the servants could barely keep up, changing bandages again and again, while even the finest silks were soon stained yellow by pus and blood. Contemporary medical notes describe Henry VIII sitting on his throne, face drawn and weary, legs tightly wrapped, but beneath the fabric, the silent, ceaseless movement of dozens of writhing maggots. Sometimes Henry himself felt their dreadful crawling, but he was simply too exhausted and broken to protest. Physicians tried to reassure him that the maggots were helpful, consuming the dead flesh and slowing the spread of infection. But that knowledge brought little comfort, only deeper humiliation for a king once feared by all of Europe. During court banquets, while the lords and ladies tried to dine in Henry's presence, whispers circled the room about the living secret inside the king's legs. Some attentive courtiers noticed dark bloodstains on the carpet, or, from time to time, a stray maggot dropping from Henry's wounds as he shifted, leaving a cold, lingering terror throughout the palace night. Even the royal doctors confided in their diaries that, at times, they felt more like caretakers of a walking corpse than servants of a living king. Picture that scene. A splendid throne, firelight dancing, bells tolling from distant abbeys, and at the very centre of power, a decaying body swarmed by maggots, consumed inch by inch. There could be no greater horror, no deeper shame, for a king once revered and dreaded across Christendom. And this is only the first truth on our journey into the royal shadows. Trust me, what comes next will be even harder to forget. After learning the grotesque truth about a king who shared his life with swarms of maggots, you might think nothing could possibly surprise you anymore. Yet the shadows in Henry VIII's mind hid commands more cruel than anyone could imagine, even for the smallest, most loyal creatures in his world. The second disturbing fact: death sentences for pets. Henry VIII ordered the execution of dogs, cats, and horses, simply for omens. Not only did people around him live in constant fear, so too did every animal in the palace, unable to escape the grip of royal power, warped by suspicion and madness. In his final years, as illness and mental instability overwhelmed Henry VIII, he became obsessed with omens, strange dreams, and the warnings of fortune-tellers and priests at court. There were nights when Henry sat sleepless, summoning astrologers to his bedside to interpret his nightmares. The mere sight of a black cat crossing his path, a dog howling at midnight, or a favourite horse falling ill was enough for Henry to believe doom was near, that demonic spirits were lurking for his crown. In these moments, he issued death sentences without a trace of hesitation. Palace records document many grim mornings, the courtyards echoing with the anguished cries of animals once cherished in the royal household. Purebred hunting dogs, once Henry's pride on the hunt, were dragged out and executed for nothing more than howling at the moon. Black cats were beheaded and hung above castle gates, condemned as carriers of witches' curses. Most heartbreaking was the story of Henry's beloved white horse, raised from a foal, slain after a fortune. Teller warned, "Satan on a white horse will bring ruin to the royal house." Courtiers tried to intervene at first, but after harsh punishments, and even loss of titles for defending the palace pets, no one dared protest. The court became a silent, haunted place, where even the smallest sound from an animal could lead to a ghastly execution. Chroniclers note that in Henry's final days, the back courtyards of Hampton Court Palace echoed not only with human sorrow, but also with the silent suffering of countless innocent creatures. It is said that, in his feverish delirium, Henry VIII would mutter, "The ghosts of dogs and cats still linger here, little traitors and witches, you will never topple my throne." That paranoia turned the palace into a true hell, not just for men and women, but for every living creature that once faithfully served their king. And this is only the second disturbing fact. Keep listening, because the secrets to come grow even darker and harder to forget. The third disturbing fact: the insomniac nightmare. Henry VIII was haunted by nightmares, sleep paralysis, and ghosts in his bedroom. In the final years of his life, sleep became an impossible luxury for Henry VIII. He lived in a constant state of anxiety and dread, almost too terrified to let himself drift into deep slumber. Whenever he managed to fall asleep, he would jolt awake moments later, drenched in sweat, his heart racing after unspeakable nightmares. Servants recounted that on many nights, shouts echoed from the king's bedchamber. Henry would scream the names of those he had sent to their deaths: youthful wives, former trusted advisors, sometimes even Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, or Anne Boleyn, the queen he'd condemned to the scaffold. There were nights he sobbed for his mother. Others he moaned and gasped as if suffocating under an invisible force. Henry was plagued by sleep paralysis, describing the sensation of someone pressing on his chest, stealing his breath. In those moments between waking and sleeping, the king swore he saw ghosts surrounding his bed. the shadows of dead queens, nameless prisoners lost to the dungeons, and grotesque faces he couldn't even recognize. His terror grew so great that he demanded more candles in his room, ordered guards to patrol the halls all night, and refused ever to be left alone in the dark. There were times, servants said, when they entered at dawn to find Henry VIII sitting motionless by the window, dark circles beneath lifeless eyes, skin as pale as the dead. He would say nothing, just motion them closer to whisper tales of restless spirits and a cursed throne. Sometimes he called for priests and magicians to pray, perform exorcisms, or banish the ghosts only he could see. This paranoia was more than illness. It was the invisible sentence haunting the soul of a king who had forever changed history. Amidst all the splendor and might, Henry VIII turned his own bedchamber into a personal hell where guilt and regret took the shape of phantoms, never letting him rest, not even in his final hours. Just imagine, after days of plots, blood, and sorrow, the mighty king reduced to a trembling, lonely figure in the dark, afraid of his own shadow. And this is only the third truth. The path ahead still hides even more shocking secrets. If the previous three truths chilled you with the darkness of the king's soul and body, this next revelation plunges you into the very pit of disgust, where absolute power turns royal rituals into a waking nightmare. The fourth disturbing fact: the bloody feast. Henry VIII forced others to dine with him amidst the stench of rotting flesh. In his final years, even as his body rotted and his stench haunted the entire palace, Henry VIII refused to give up his lavish banquets, symbols of his authority. Instead of hiding from public view, he demanded that his closest courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and even his new queens join him for hours-long feasts in his private chamber. No one was allowed to refuse. The scene defied all imagination. A chamber thick with the scent of death, candles burning brightly yet powerless against the stench of decaying flesh, pus oozing from the king's ulcers, and blood dripping onto the tablecloth. Henry sat regally at the head, his massive body dominating the long table, legs wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. Sometimes he would laugh and chat, all the while dabbing away streams of foul discharge, unfazed by the horror on his guests' faces. The courtiers' men who once lived and died by loyalty now had to swallow their nausea, forcing down food while trying desperately not to look at the grotesque spectacle before them. Some could not endure it, fainting at the table or stuffing herbs up their noses to mask the smell. Every sound, the slice of meat, the king's groans, the guests' ragged breaths became part of a macabre ritual, like a sacrificial rite in the shadows. Records recall that the French ambassador described these gatherings as banquets from hell, where all boundaries between power, loyalty, and fear dissolved. On stormy nights at Hampton Court, the howling of dogs mingled with the stench of death, making the air even more eerie. People whispered that only those who survived Henry's bloody feasts could understand the true price of power and decay. Even after the feasts ended, the stench lingered on clothes, in hair, and deep within memories. Perhaps for the rest of their lives, they could never forget that horror. A king reigning over his rotting kingdom, turning every subject into a hostage of disgust and dread. If you thought the horrors might stop here, brace yourself, the fifth and final truth is even more chilling. After those hellish feasts that haunted every corner of the palace, you might think the horror ended with the rotting flesh of this dreadful king. Yet the most chilling truth of all comes from the invisible world where power, glory, and guilt dissolve, leaving only the shadow of an unbreakable curse. The fifth disturbing fact: the final curse, a generational hex, and ominous omens, after Henry VIII's death. As Henry VIII's corpse was hurriedly buried on a cold night at Windsor, strange phenomena began to unfold everywhere. The trees around his massive grave slowly withered. Leaves dropped lifeless to the ground, even though the royal gardens flourished year-round. No one could explain it. Even the birds avoided that patch of earth, leaving behind a haunting silence. Weeks later, the ancient bell tower suddenly rang with a strange, chilling note and then collapsed, as if announcing doom. Witnesses claimed that on that night, guards stationed by the king's resting place saw pale, flickering figures, white shadows drifting around the tomb, vanishing and reappearing like restless souls. Worse still, many who participated in the funeral procession or served near Henry's remains fell suddenly ill, some dying inexplicably. Some suffered high fevers, muttering the king's name and swearing they were being pulled into inescapable darkness. Rumour swept the court. Henry's vengeful spirit had cursed anyone who saw or touched his rotting death. That fear spread quickly. The surviving courtiers became silent, each avoiding mention of the dead king's name. Some families fled Windsor. Others built home altars and prayed for peace, believing that only ancient rites could ward off the darkness left by Henry. Even generations later, tales of Henry VIII's curse are whispered beside fireplaces on cold English nights. People believe the curse haunted not just the Tudor dynasty, but all of England for centuries, plunging the nation into endless wars, division, and tragedy. So it was that a king who once manipulated the fate of Europe left not only a legacy of blood and fear, but an invisible shadow that stretched from palace to graveyard, deep into the memory of a nation. You might turn off the lights and close this story tonight, but perhaps the darkness of that curse still lingers, waiting to be told again. So tonight, we have journeyed together through nearly 5 centuries of darkness, following each breath, each wound, each agony, and even the lingering ghosts that haunted the life of England's most powerful king. The story of Henry VIII is not just a chronicle of power, rise, and fall. It is a chilling symphony of physical pain, spiritual torment, and the price of sin echoing through generations. Behind the lavish banquets and the laughter of power, beneath velvet robes and the glittering throne, was a small, vulnerable man trapped by disease and an unending loneliness. Once celebrated as the Golden Prince, Henry VIII shook all of Europe with a single decision, making popes and courtiers bow to his will. Yet, the higher he climbed, the deeper he sank into the mire of suspicion, fear, and ultimately, a ruin of body and mind that neither dynasty, family, nor history could ever rescue. Looking back on his tragedy, we realize absolute power is a double-edged sword. It can lift a man to legend, but it can also destroy dignity, happiness, and the soul itself. The horrifying truths about Henry VIII serve as a warning to us all that behind every crown and historic decree, there lurk silent fears, desires, and unseen wounds. Perhaps what makes this tale truly haunting is not the image of a corpse decaying or a curse lasting centuries, but that final moment when a man, once holding the fate of a nation, must confront himself with all his loneliness and unforgivable sins. There, the true greatness of history lies not in thrones, achievements, or gilded words, but in lessons about the human heart, about compassion, and about the limits of power. Thank you for joining me on this long, shadowed, and thought-provoking journey. If you are still awake, share your feelings in the comments. Let me know that you're not just a listener, but a fellow traveler reflecting on history. Wishing you a peaceful night, and perhaps keep a little light on for the wandering souls of the past. See you in the next story where history will live again, this time in the light of understanding and empathy.